The dawn broke over Walla Walla, Washington Territory in 1881 with a sight that made Amelia Ashford sink to her knees in the dirt, her hands trembling as they reached for the ruined earth where her wheat seedlings had once stood in perfect rows. Every single stalk had been crushed into the mud, hoofprints stamped deep into the soil she had spent 3 months preparing, and her entire future lay destroyed before the sun had fully risen. She had bet everything on this crop. Every cent her father had left her when consumption took him the previous winter, and now some thoughtless riders had galloped through her 20 acres in the night, probably drunk and racing each other without a care for whose dreams they trampled beneath their horses. The wind carried the smell of disturbed earth and broken stems, and Amelia felt tears burn hot tracks down her cheeks as she surveyed the destruction. She was 22 years old, alone except for her younger brother Timothy, who was only 15 and working in the lumber mill to help make ends meet, and this wheat crop had been their chance to keep the small farm her father had carved out of the wilderness. Without it, the bank would foreclose by autumn, and they would lose the only home they had ever known. She did not hear the rider approach until his horse was nearly upon her, and she looked up through blurred vision to see a tall man dismounting from a paint stallion, his weather-beaten hat casting shadows across a face that might have been carved from the same rough stone as the Blue Mountains, visible in the distance. He moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time in a saddle than in any chair, and his blue eyes took in the destroyed field with an expression that shifted from curiosity to something harder and colder. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest, "I am guessing you did not invite those riders to dance through your wheat." Amelia struggled to her feet, brushing dirt from her worn calico dress and trying to compose herself even though her world was ending. "They came through sometime after midnight. I heard the horses, but by the time I got outside with the rifle, they were already gone, whooping and hollering like it was all some grand joke." The stranger walked into the field, crouching down to examine the hoofprints with the careful attention of someone reading a story written in the earth. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had, and Amelia found herself studying him despite her devastation. He wore dusty trail clothes that had seen better days, a gun belt slung low on his hips, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was not a man who let injustice slide by without comment. "4 horses," he said after a long moment, standing and following the tracks with his eyes. "Heading northeast when they left, probably back toward town. One of them has a loose shoe on the rear left hoof, chips out a piece of dirt with every step. Another one is carrying extra weight, maybe 250 pounds of rider, pulls deeper on the right side, so he favors that leg in the saddle." Amelia stared at him, surprised by the detail he could pull from simple hoofprints. "You can tell all that from looking at the ground?" "Yes, madam. Been tracking men and animals for near about 15 years now. My name is Dalton Xavier, and I was riding through on my way to Spokane Falls when I saw your place from the road. Figured I would ask if you had any work that needed doing in exchange for a hot meal, but it looks like you have got troubles enough without taking on a drifter." She almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. "I cannot even afford to feed myself once winter comes, let alone hire help. Those riders destroyed my entire crop, every seed I planted, and I do not have the money to buy more seed or the time to replant even if I did. The growing season is already short this far north." Dalton was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the trampled field with an intensity that made Amelia wonder what he was thinking. Then he turned back to her, and there was something in his expression that looked like barely controlled anger, though she sensed it was not directed at her. "What if I could get those riders to replant every seed they destroyed?" he asked. "Would that set things right?" Amelia blinked at him, certain she had misheard. "That is impossible. I do not even know who they were, and even if I did, what would make them care? Men like that do not face consequences for ruining a woman's property. The sheriff would probably just tell me it was an accident and that I should have fenced my field better." "I did not ask if it was likely, madam. I asked if it would set things right." There was something in his voice that made her believe he was serious, that this stranger, who had appeared out of nowhere on the worst morning of her life, actually intended to track down the men who had destroyed her crop and make them face justice. It seemed like a fantasy, the kind of story her father used to tell her about heroes from the old days, but Dalton Xavier did not look like a man who made promises he could not keep. Yes, she said quietly. If they replanted every seed row by row like it was before, then I would still have a chance to bring in a harvest before the first frost. But I do not understand why you would help me. You do not know me, and this is not your fight. Dalton settled his hat more firmly on his head, already turning back toward his horse. My mother ran a small farm in Colorado after my father died. She broke her back working that land, and one year some rich rancher's cattle broke through and trampled her corn. He told her it was just bad luck and that she should not have planted so close to the open range. She lost everything, and we ended up in a mining camp, where she worked herself to death in a boarding house kitchen before she was 40 years old. So maybe this is not my fight, madam, but I have seen what happens when people with power crush people without it and face no consequences. I am tired of seeing it. He swung into his saddle with easy grace, gathering the reins in one hand. I will need to borrow a wagon and some rope if you have it, and I am going to need you to trust me even though you have got no reason to. Can you do that? Amelia felt something shift in her chest, a spark of hope she had not felt since she first saw the destroyed field. The wagon is in the barn. Take whatever you need. But Mr. Xavier, please be careful. I do not want anyone getting hurt over this, not even the men who did this. I am not planning on hurting anyone, madam. But I am planning on making sure they understand that actions have consequences, something their fathers should have taught them a long time ago. He rode toward the barn, and Amelia watched him go, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. She did not understand what had just happened, did not understand why this stranger was willing to risk himself for someone he had never met, but she found herself hoping with a desperation that surprised her that he would succeed. Because if he did not, if this was just empty promises that would blow away like dust on the wind, then she was not sure she could bear the disappointment. Dalton returned 20 minutes later with her father's old wagon hitched behind his horse, and she had gathered what rope they had along with some canvas tarps he might need. He loaded everything with efficient movements, checking the wagon wheels and the harness connections with the thoroughness of someone who knew that details mattered. I should be back by evening, he said. If I am not back by tomorrow morning, then I ran into trouble and you should just go on with your life like I never stopped by. That is not a comforting thing to say, Amelia replied, hugging herself against the morning chill. No, madam, I suppose it is not, but I believe in being honest about the risks. He paused, one hand on the saddle horn, and looked at her with those intense blue eyes. What is your name? Seems like I should know it if I am going to be fighting your battles. Amelia Ashford, and this was my father's farm before he died last winter. Well, Miss Ashford, I will do my best to make sure your father's work was not in vain. Then he was riding away, the wagon rattling behind him as he followed the hoofprints northeast toward town, and Amelia was left standing in her ruined field with her heart in her throat and a hope she barely dared to acknowledge taking root in her chest. The hours that followed were the longest of Amelia's life. She tried to busy herself with the chickens and the kitchen garden, with mending the tears in Timothy's work shirts and preparing a stew from the last of the salt pork. But her mind kept wandering to Dalton Xavier and whatever he was doing to track down the riders. Part of her worried that he would confront them and violence would erupt, that he would be hurt or killed over her wheat field, and the guilt of that possibility sat heavy on her shoulders. Another part of her, a part she was not entirely proud of, hoped that he would succeed, that those careless riders who had destroyed her future would face some kind of justice for what they had done. Timothy came home from the mill at supper time, his face drawn with exhaustion and sawdust still clinging to his clothes. He was a thin boy, all elbows and knees, who looked too young to be working 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions, but they had no choice. When Amelia told him about the destroyed crop and the mysterious cowboy who had promised to make things right, He listened with wide eyes that held both hope and skepticism. You think he is really going to get them to replant everything? Timothy asked, wolfing down his second bowl of stew like he had not eaten in days. That sounds like something from one of those dime novels, Amelia. Things like that do not happen in real life. I know, she admitted. But there was something about him, Timothy. He was not making empty promises. He meant every word he said. Or maybe he is just a confidence man who saw a desperate woman and told her what she wanted to hear. Maybe right now he is in a saloon somewhere spending whatever money he lifted from our barn while he was pretending to get the wagon ready. Amelia had not checked to see if anything was missing, and the thought sent a bolt of panic through her. She hurried to the barn, Timothy following behind, and together they searched through their meager possessions. But nothing was gone. Not her father's old pocket watch that she kept hidden in a coffee tin, not the small leather pouch with their remaining money, not even the silver bridle buckles that were worth at least a few dollars. Everything was exactly as it had been, except the wagon was gone and the rope she had given Dalton. He did not take anything, she said, relief washing over her. He really is trying to help. Timothy shrugged, still skeptical but less certain now. I guess we will find out when he comes back, if he comes back. They were finishing the supper dishes when the sound of horses and wagon wheels reached them through the open window. Amelia's heart leaped into her throat, and she rushed to the door with Timothy right behind her. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold over the blue mountains, and in that dramatic light, she saw something that made her gasp out loud. Dalton Xavier was leading a procession that looked like something out of a fever dream. 4 young men, none of them older than 25, were walking behind his horse, their hands bound in front of them with rope that was tied to his saddle. They looked furious and humiliated, and one of them had what appeared to be the beginnings of a black eye. Behind them came the wagon, now loaded with sacks that Amelia recognized as seed wheat, and bringing up the rear were 3 more riders, older men who watched the bound men with expressions of stern disapproval. Dalton reined in his horse near the porch, and Amelia could see that he was tired but unhurt, dust covering him from hat to boots. Miss Ashford, I would like to introduce you to the men who trampled your wheat. That one on the left is Charlie Winters, son of the banker who holds the deed to your land. Next to him is James Porter, whose father owns the feed and grain. Then we have Marcus Sloan and Pete Daniels, sons of the mayor and the owner of the Walla Walla Hotel, respectively. Behind them in the wagon are enough seed wheat to replant your entire field twice over, courtesy of Mr. Porter's father's store, who was very understanding once he learned what his son had done. The 3 older men dismounted, and Amelia recognized them now. Henry Porter ran the largest feed store in town. Mayor Sloan had been elected just last year, and Marcus Daniels owned half the businesses on Main Street. They all looked like they wanted to be anywhere but here, and the shame on their faces was almost as deep as the fury on their sons' faces. Miss Ashford, Henry Porter said, removing his hat. I cannot begin to apologize for my son's behavior. When Mr. Xavier explained what James and his friends had done, I was ashamed to call him my boy. They were racing through the countryside drunk, treating other people's property like it was nothing, and they need to learn that actions have consequences. Mayor Sloan nodded, his face grave. My Marcus is going to replant every single seed he destroyed, and he is going to do it properly. They all are. And once that is done, they are going to pay damages to you for your time and suffering, money that is coming out of their own pockets and inheritances. Dalton dismounted and began untying the ropes that bound the young men to his saddle. They are going to start first thing tomorrow morning, and they are going to work every day until this field is planted proper. I will be here to make sure they do it right, and these gentlemen have agreed to check on the progress to ensure their sons do not try to get out of their obligations. Charlie Winters, the banker's son, glared at Dalton with pure hatred. You had no right to drag us here like criminals. We were just having fun, and it was an accident that we rode through some stupid wheat field. The crack of Henry Porter's hand against his own son's face echoed across the farmyard, shocking everyone into silence. You will show respect to Miss Ashford, and you will be grateful that Mr. Xavier convinced us to handle this privately instead of involving the law. Trespassing and destruction of property could land you in jail, and maybe that is what should happen. James Porter looked like he might cry, the red mark blooming on his cheek, a stark contrast to his pale skin. I am sorry, Miss Ashford. We did not think about what we were doing. We were drunk and stupid, and I am sorry. It was not much of an apology, and Amelia could tell it came more from fear of his father than actual remorse. But it was a start. She looked at the four young men, these sons of privilege who had nearly destroyed her life without a second thought, and felt a complicated mix of anger and pity. They had never faced real consequences before, never understood that their actions affected real people with real lives, and maybe this would teach them something important. I accept your apology, she said quietly, and I appreciate you replanting what you destroyed. I hope you learn from this. The fathers nodded approvingly, and Mayor Sloan stepped forward with a small leather pouch. This is $100 as an initial payment for damages. We will assess further compensation once the crop is replanted and we can calculate the full cost of your time and suffering. $100 was more money than Amelia had seen in months, and she felt tears prick her eyes as she accepted it. Thank you. This is very generous. It is what is right, Marcus Daniels said, and we are grateful to Mr. Xavier for bringing this matter to our attention in a way that gave us the chance to make it right. He could have just shot our boys for what they did, and many men would have considered it justified. Dalton was unloading the seed wheat from the wagon, stacking the heavy sacks near the barn with easy strength. I told you I was not planning on hurting anyone, but these boys need to understand that the world does not belong to them just because their fathers have money. Other people are trying to survive out here, and careless cruelty can destroy lives. The fathers stayed another hour, discussing the details of the replanting and making sure their sons understood exactly what was expected of them. They would arrive at dawn and work until dusk, bringing their own food and water so as not to burden Amelia further. Dalton would supervise to ensure the work was done properly, and the fathers would rotate through to check on progress. Once the field was replanted to Dalton's satisfaction, the boys would be released from their obligation, though the shame of what they had done would hopefully stay with them for a long time. After the fathers and their sons had ridden away, Dalton finished unloading the wagon and then led his horse to the water trough. Amelia watched him work, still trying to process everything that had happened, still trying to understand how this stranger had accomplished in one day what should have been impossible. How did you do it? She asked finally. How did you track them down and convince their fathers to make them face consequences? Dalton took off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, and Amelia noticed for the first time that he was actually quite handsome beneath all the trail dust and weariness. The hoof prints led right to the livery stable in town, which made it easy. I found the horses, and the ostler remembered the boys who had ridden out late last night, drunk and rowdy. He even knew their names because they are town boys who cause trouble regularly. So I went to each of their fathers, explained what had happened, and told them they had a choice. They could make their sons replant the field and pay damages, or I could take the matter to the territorial marshal and make it official. They chose the first option, though it took some convincing. Some convincing, Amelia repeated, eyeing the bruise she could now see forming on his knuckles. Did you have to fight them? Charlie Winters took a swing at me when I confronted him at the bank. I just defended myself. His father was actually grateful that I only gave him a black eye instead of shooting him, which I would have been within my rights to do, given that he attacked me first. Timothy had been listening to all of this with something like awe on his young face. That is the bravest thing I have ever heard. You stood up to the richest men in town for someone you do not even know. Dalton shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. It was just the right thing to do. Nothing brave about it. But Amelia knew it was more than that. In a world where people with money and power rarely faced consequences, where a woman alone was expected to just accept whatever injustice came her way, Dalton Xavier had fought for her. He had risked his own safety and spent his entire day tracking down those riders and forcing them to face what they had done. And now he was planning to stay and supervise the replanting, giving up whatever plans he had for Spokane Falls to make sure justice was served. "You should stay for supper," she said impulsively. "And we have a spare room since my father passed. You are welcome to sleep in a real bed instead of on the ground." Dalton hesitated, and she could see him weighing the offer, clearly uncomfortable with accepting charity. "I do not want to be a burden, madam. You have already been through enough without taking in a stranger." "You are not a stranger anymore, Mr. Xavier. You are the man who saved my farm and possibly my entire future. The least I can do is offer you a meal and a bed. Besides, you said you would supervise the replanting, and that will be easier if you are staying here instead of riding back and forth from town." He smiled then, a slow smile that transformed his stern face into something warmer and more approachable. "Well, when you put it that way, I suppose it would be practical to accept. Thank you, Miss Ashford. I appreciate the kindness." They ate a late supper of the stew she had made earlier, and Amelia found herself studying Dalton in the lamplight, curious about this man who had appeared out of nowhere like an answer to a prayer she had not even thought to speak. He was older than her, she guessed maybe 30, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen a lot of life and learned hard lessons along the way. His hands were scarred and calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind, but there was a gentleness in the way he spoke to Timothy, answering the boy's endless questions about tracking and horses and life on the trail. "Where are you from originally?" Amelia asked when Timothy finally paused for breath. "You mentioned your mother was in Colorado." "Born in Missouri, but we moved around a lot after my father died. Colorado, Kansas, Texas for a while. I have been working as a hired hand and sometimes as a guide for wagon trains, taking whatever work I can find. I was heading up to Spokane Falls because I heard they are hiring at the lumber mills there. Thought maybe it was time to settle down in one place for a while." "Do you have any family left?" Timothy asked. Something sad flickered across Dalton's face. "No, my mother was the last. She passed when I was about your age, maybe a little older. Been on my own since then." Amelia felt her heart clench with sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose parents, to feel that terrible aloneness that came with being untethered in the world. "I am sorry. That must have been very hard." "It was, but it taught me to stand on my own 2 feet, and it taught me to recognize when someone else needs help. So maybe something good came out of the hardship." After supper, Amelia showed Dalton to the spare room, which had been her father's before the end. She had cleaned it out weeks ago, unable to bear the sight of his empty bed and abandoned belongings, but she had kept the room ready in case Timothy ever wanted to move out of the loft. The bed was narrow, but the mattress was good, stuffed with fresh straw and covered with one of her mother's old quilts, and there was a washstand with a pitcher of water and clean towels. "This is more luxury than I am used to," Dalton said, setting his saddlebags down carefully. "Thank you, Miss Ashford. Please call me Amelia. After everything you have done for me today, I think we can dispense with the formalities." He looked at her for a long moment, and Amelia felt something flutter in her chest under the intensity of his gaze. "Amelia, then. And you can call me Dalton. Mr. Xavier makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and working in an office somewhere." She laughed, the sound surprising her because she had not thought she would ever laugh again after seeing her destroyed field that morning. "Somehow I cannot imagine you in an office, Dalton." "No, madam, neither can I." Amelia left him to settle in, her mind whirling as she prepared for bed. The day had started as the worst of her life and had somehow transformed into something else entirely. She had her seed wheat back. She had financial compensation that would help her survive until harvest. And she had a mysterious cowboy sleeping in her spare room who had fought for her when no one else would have. It was like something out of one of those romantic stories she used to read before her father got sick, and she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than just replanted wheat. The four young men arrived at dawn as promised, sullen and resentful but present. Dalton was already up and waiting for them, having made coffee for himself and Amelia in the kitchen while the stars were still visible. He had marked out the field in sections the night before, planning the work with a precision that suggested he knew farming better than he let on. "You are going to work in pairs," Dalton told them, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even Charlie Winters pay attention. "Charlie and James on the west section, Marcus and Pete on the east. You are going to prepare the soil first, break up the compacted earth where you trampled it, and then plant the seeds in straight rows 18 inches apart. I will be checking your work, and if it is not done right, you will tear it up and start over." Marcus Sloane groaned. "Do you have any idea how long that is going to take?" "About as long as it takes to do it properly," Dalton replied without sympathy. "You destroyed this field in minutes while you were having your fun. Now you get to spend days fixing what you broke. That seems fair to me." They worked all day under Dalton's watchful eye, and Amelia brought them water at midday because even though they had wronged her, she could not bear to watch them suffer from thirst in the growing heat. They thanked her grudgingly, and she noticed that James Porter looked genuinely ashamed of himself, his eyes avoiding hers as he drank deeply from the ladle. "I really am sorry, Miss Ashford," he said quietly when the others had moved away. "I know that does not fix anything, but I mean it. We were stupid and cruel, and I am glad someone finally made us face what we did." Amelia studied him, this boy who was barely younger than her and who had nearly destroyed her life. "I believe you, James, and I hope this teaches you to think about consequences before you act. It will. I promise you that." Dalton worked alongside the boys when needed, showing them the proper technique for planting wheat, correcting their mistakes with a patience that surprised Amelia. She watched him from the kitchen window as she prepared bread dough, admiring the way he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. He never raised his voice or lost his temper, but the boys obeyed him like he was a general, and they were his troops. Over the next week, a routine developed. The boys arrived at dawn and worked until dusk, slowly replanting the trampled field row by row. Their fathers rotated through to check on progress, always nodding in approval at what they saw. Dalton supervised tirelessly, and in the evenings he would help Amelia with the heavier chores, chopping wood and repairing the sagging fence posts that her father had never gotten around to fixing before he got sick. Timothy worshipped Dalton like a hero, following him around whenever he was not at the mill, absorbing lessons about tracking and horsemanship and what it meant to be a man of integrity. Dalton was patient with the boy, treating him with the kind of respect that Timothy rarely got from other adults, and Amelia felt herself falling a little bit in love every time she watched them together. Because that was what was happening, she realized as the days passed. She was falling in love with Dalton Xavier, this mysterious cowboy who had ridden into her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. She loved the way he drank his coffee in the morning, strong and black without sugar. She loved the sound of his laugh when Timothy told a particularly bad joke. She loved the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, his blue eyes soft with something that might have been tenderness. But she did not know if he felt the same way. He was kind to her, certainly, and respectful in a way that made her feel valued rather than diminished. But kindness and respect were not the same as love, and she had no idea if he saw her as anything more than a woman he had helped out of a sense of justice. One evening after the boys had left and Timothy had gone to bed, Amelia and Dalton sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The wheat field was more than half replanted now, the neat rows a testament to hard work and consequences faced. In another week, maybe less, the job would be done, and Dalton would be free to continue his journey to Spokane Falls. The thought of him leaving made Amelia's chest ache with a loneliness she had not felt even in the worst days after her father's death. You will be able to move on soon, she said, trying to keep her voice light. I am sure you are eager to get to those lumber mills and start your new job. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I am not sure I am in such a hurry anymore. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his expression was difficult to read. I mean that I have been drifting for a long time, Amelia, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots, always telling myself that I was looking for something better, somewhere I belonged. But this week, helping you and Timothy, watching that field come back to life, it has made me think that maybe I have been looking for the wrong things. What have you been looking for? She asked softly. Purpose, I suppose. A reason to stay in one place. Someone worth staying for. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility, and Amelia felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to know if he was saying what she hoped he was saying, but fear held her tongue. What if she was wrong? What if he was just talking about general principles and not about her specifically? Before she could gather the courage to speak, Dalton stood up, his movements restless. I should check on the horses before it gets full dark. Thank you for another good supper, Amelia. Then he was gone, striding toward the barn, and Amelia was left on the porch with her heart pounding and questions burning on her lips. The next day, Henry Porter arrived with news that changed everything. Miss Ashford, I wanted you to know that the bank has agreed to extend your loan another year without penalty. My son Charlie went to his father and explained what they had done to your field, and Mr. Winters felt it was only right to give you more time, given the circumstances. Amelia felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. The loan extension meant she would not lose the farm, even if the replanted wheat did not yield as much as she had hoped. It meant breathing room, a chance to build stability instead of always racing against disaster. Thank you, Mr. Porter. That is incredibly generous. It is the least we can do, and I wanted you to know that James has been different since he started working here. After Porter left, Amelia went to find Dalton, needing to share the good news with someone who would understand what it meant. She found him in the wheat field, checking the progress of the replanting with his usual careful attention to detail. The four boys were working steadily now, no longer resentful but focused, and she could see that James especially was taking pride in the straight rows he was creating. Dalton, the bank extended my loan, she said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. I have another year before I need to worry about foreclosure. He turned to her with a smile that transformed his whole face. That is wonderful news, Amelia. You deserve some good fortune after everything you have been through. She wanted to throw her arms around him, wanted to share her happiness in a physical way, but propriety held her back. Instead, she just smiled at him, hoping he could see in her eyes everything she was feeling. It is because of you, she said. None of this would have happened if you had not stopped that morning, if you had not cared enough to track down those riders and make them face consequences. You saved my farm, Dalton. You saved my entire future. You would have found a way, he said. You are stronger than you think, Amelia Ashford. Maybe. But I am glad I did not have to find out. That night, Amelia lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the old farmhouse settling around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Dalton moving in the spare room, and she wondered if he was sleeping or if he was lying awake too, thinking about whatever was growing between them. She had never felt this way about anyone before. There had been a few boys in town who had courted her when she was younger, before her father got sick, and all her time became consumed with caring for him and trying to keep the farm running. But none of them had made her feel the way Dalton did, like her heart was a wild thing trying to escape her chest, like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. The question was whether he felt the same way, and whether she had the courage to find out. The answer came 2 days later, when the wheat field was finally completely replanted. The four young men stood back to survey their work, and even they could not hide the pride on their faces. The field looked perfect, every row straight and properly spaced, the seeds nestled into soil that had been carefully prepared and tended. It was better than Amelia could have done herself, and she felt tears of gratitude blur her vision as she looked at what they had accomplished. "It is finished," Dalton said, walking the perimeter one last time to make sure everything met his standards. "You boys did good work. You should be proud of yourselves." Charlie Winters, who had been the most resentful at the beginning, actually smiled. "It feels good to build something instead of destroying it. I never understood that before." Their fathers arrived to inspect the work and were clearly impressed. Mayor Sloan clasped his son on the shoulder with genuine pride, and Henry Porter shook James's hand like he was greeting a man instead of a boy. They presented Amelia with an additional $50 as compensation for her time and trouble, and each of the boys apologized to her again, this time with sincerity that rang true. After they had all ridden away, Amelia stood in her perfect wheat field with Dalton beside her, and the silence between them felt charged with everything they had not yet said to each other. "You will be leaving now," she said, trying to keep the sadness from her voice. "Heading north to Spokane Falls like you planned." Dalton turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "What if I did not want to leave?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have been thinking about what I said the other night, about looking for purpose and someone worth staying for, and I think I have found both of those things right here." Amelia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Dalton, I do not understand." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, close enough to catch the scent of soap and leather and the outdoors that always clung to him. "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, Amelia Ashford. I have loved watching you fight for your farm and your future. I have loved the way you treat your brother with such tenderness, the way you showed kindness to those boys, even after they wronged you. I have loved sharing coffee with you in the mornings and talking with you on the porch in the evenings. And the thought of riding away from here, of never seeing you again, feels like tearing my own heart out of my chest." Amelia could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the overwhelming joy that flooded through her at his words. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you promised to make those riders replant every seed. You are the most honorable man I have ever met, Dalton Xavier, and I do not want you to leave. I want you to stay here with me and Timothy. I want to build a life with you." He cupped her face in his scarred, calloused hands, and the gentleness of his touch made her want to cry. "Are you sure? I do not have much to offer you except hard work and a promise to stand by you no matter what comes. That is everything I have ever wanted," she said. "That is more than I ever dreamed of having." Then he was kissing her, soft and careful at first, then deeper as she responded with all the pent-up longing she had been holding inside. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing close to him, and felt like she had finally come home after a long journey through darkness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers and laughed softly. "I came here to track down some careless riders, and I ended up finding my whole future." "So did I," Amelia said. "So did I." They told Timothy that evening, and the boy let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way to town. "Does this mean Dalton is staying forever? Does this mean he will marry you?" Dalton looked at Amelia with a question in his eyes, and she nodded, happiness overwhelming her. "If she will have me, yes. I would be honored to marry your sister Timothy, and to be part of this family." "Of course she will have you," Timothy said, rolling his eyes like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She has been mooning over you for days. I am not blind." Amelia felt her cheeks flush red, but she could not stop smiling. "I have not been mooning." "You absolutely have been," Timothy said cheerfully. "But I do not blame you. Dalton is the best thing that ever happened to us." They were married 6 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Walla Walla, with Timothy standing as witness and half the town in attendance. The story of the trampled wheat field and the cowboy who had made the riders replant every seed had spread through the community, taking on almost legendary proportions. People wanted to meet the man who had stood up to the richest families in town and one who had fought for justice when it would have been easier to look the other way. Henry Porter gave Amelia away, since her father was gone, and Porter felt he owed her that honor after what his son had done. The four young men who had trampled her field came to the wedding too, and they gave her a beautiful carved wooden hope chest they had made themselves as a wedding present, a symbol of the growth and change they had undergone. Amelia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper for years, and when she walked down the aisle toward Dalton, she felt like she was walking toward her entire future. He looked handsome in his Sunday best, his dark hair neatly combed and his blue eyes shining with love, and when he took her hand, she knew she was making the right choice. "I love you," he whispered as the preacher began the ceremony. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Forever." The harvest that fall was abundant beyond Amelia's wildest dreams. The replanted wheat grew strong and tall, ripening to a golden sea that stretched across all 20 acres. Dalton worked beside her through the long days of cutting and threshing, and Timothy helped when he was not at the mill. They brought in enough wheat to pay off a significant portion of the bank loan and to put money aside for seed and supplies for the next year. The farm that had nearly been lost was now thriving, and it was all because a mysterious cowboy had cared enough to stop and help a stranger in need. As winter settled over Walla Walla, bringing snow to the Blue Mountains and frost to the fields, Amelia and Dalton settled into married life with a contentment that felt almost too good to be true. Dalton took over the heavy work of the farm, his experience and knowledge making tasks easier that had once been overwhelming. He fixed the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 years, rebuilt the chicken coop to protect against foxes, and started clearing additional acreage so they could plant more wheat in the spring. Timothy flourished under Dalton's mentorship, growing taller and stronger and more confident with each passing month. Dalton taught him everything he knew about horses and tracking, about reading the weather and understanding the land, about what it meant to be a man of integrity who stood up for what was right. The skinny boy who had been working himself to exhaustion in the lumber mill gradually transformed into a young man who carried himself with pride and purpose. In the evenings after the work was done and supper was eaten, the three of them would sit by the fire while Dalton read aloud from books borrowed from the small library in town. He had a good reading voice, rich and warm, and Amelia loved to listen to him bring stories to life. Sometimes they would just talk, sharing dreams and memories, building the kind of deep connection that came from truly knowing each other. On one such evening in late January, with the wind howling outside and snow piling up against the windows, Dalton surprised Amelia with a small carved wooden box. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain, the kind of jewelry she had never owned because such things were beyond her family's means. "I have been saving up to buy you something special," Dalton said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I wanted you to have something that showed you how much you mean to me." Amelia opened the locket to find two tiny photographs inside, one of her parents on their wedding day, and one that Dalton must have commissioned from the photographer in town, showing Dalton and Timothy standing together with the wheat field behind them. "My family," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Past and present and future. All the family I ever needed," Dalton said, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me a home, Amelia. You gave me a reason to stop drifting and start building something that lasts." That night, as they lay together in the bed they now shared, Amelia told Dalton the news she had been holding inside for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I am going to have a baby. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when I went in for what I thought was just a winter cold." Dalton went very still, and for a moment she worried that he was upset or frightened. Then he let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and he gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? She asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. Happy does not even begin to cover it. I never thought I would have this, Amelia. A wife, a home, a child on the way. I thought I would spend my whole life alone, drifting from place to place with nothing to anchor me. But you changed everything. You gave me a future worth fighting for. The baby was born in late summer, during the height of the harvest season. They named him Daniel after Dalton's father, and he came into the world healthy and squalling with a shock of dark hair just like his father's. Amelia had never known love like this existed, the fierce protective love that filled her as she held her son for the first time. Dalton cried when he held Daniel, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face as he cradled the tiny infant in his strong hands. "Hello, little man," he whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you that I will always protect you and love you and teach you to be a good man." Timothy was instantly smitten with his nephew, hovering over the cradle and insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to midnight feedings. At 17 now, he was nearly a man himself, tall and broad-shouldered from the farm work, and Dalton was already talking about making him a full partner in the farm operation. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. There were droughts and early frosts, years when the wheat yield was poor and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries, the inevitable challenges that came with farming in the Washington Territory. But through it all, Amelia and Dalton faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Anna when Daniel was 3, and another son named David when Anna was 2. The farmhouse that had once felt empty and sad was now filled with laughter and noise, with children running through the rooms and toys scattered across the floor. Dalton built additions to accommodate their growing family, adding a bedroom for Timothy and a larger kitchen for Amelia, slowly transforming the small farm into something substantial and lasting. Charlie Winters and James Porter both came to work for them during harvest season in those years. No longer the careless boys who had trampled the wheat, but responsible young men who remembered the lesson they had learned. James eventually married and started his own small farm on land his father helped him purchase, and he always credited Dalton with teaching him what it meant to take responsibility for your actions. The story of the trampled wheat field and the cowboy who made the riders replant every seed became part of Walla Walla's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. People used it as a teaching story for their children, a reminder that actions had consequences and that justice was possible even when the odds seemed impossible. On their 10th anniversary, Dalton took Amelia back to the wheat field where everything had started, where she had knelt in the mud and felt like her world was ending. It was evening, the sun setting in brilliant colors over the blue mountains, and the wheat was almost ready for harvest, swaying in the gentle breeze like a golden ocean. "Do you remember that morning?" Dalton asked, holding her hand as they walked through the rows they had planted together so many times now. "I will never forget it," Amelia said. "I thought my life was over, and then you rode up like something out of a dream and changed everything." "I rode up here looking for work and a hot meal," Dalton said with a smile. "I had no idea I was going to find my whole life." "Do you ever regret staying? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had gone on to Spokane Falls like you planned?" He turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands the way he had that first time he kissed her. "Not for a single moment. Everything I ever wanted is right here. You, our children, this farm we built together. I have never been happier than I am right now, and that happiness grows every single day." Amelia leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the solid warmth of him against her. "I love you, Dalton Xavier. I loved you from the moment you promised to make those riders replant every seed, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you, Amelia Xavier. You are my home, my heart, my everything." They stood together in the wheat field as the sun sank below the mountains, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that would last forever. The children's voices drifted from the farmhouse, calling them back for supper, and hand in hand, they walked toward the home they had created together. Timothy eventually married a girl from town and started his own small horse ranch on land adjacent to the farm, staying close to the sister and brother-in-law who had become his true family. He named his firstborn son Dalton in honor of the man who had taught him what it meant to be honorable and strong. The four young men who had trampled the wheat field all went on to become respected members of the community, and they never forgot the lesson they had learned. They raised their own children to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that how you treated others mattered more than money or status. As for Amelia and Dalton, they grew old together on the farm, watching their children grow up and have children of their own. Daniel took over the main farm operation, inheriting his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce determination. Anna married a school teacher and moved to Seattle, but she came home every summer with her family. David became a lawman, carrying on his father's commitment to justice and fairness. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the grandchildren were asleep, Amelia and Dalton would sit on the porch and watch the stars emerge, just as they had done in those early days when they were first falling in love. Dalton's hair had gone silver, and his face was lined with age, but his blue eyes still looked at her with the same love and devotion they always had. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Amelia asked one such evening, her head resting on his shoulder. "What is that, my love?" "I think about how different my life would have been if those boys had never trampled my wheat, if you had ridden past my farm that morning instead of stopping. All the happiness I have known, all the love we have shared, it came from something that seemed like the worst disaster of my life." Dalton kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "I think about that too. How a moment of cruelty and carelessness led to us finding each other. I am not glad those boys hurt you, but I am grateful that I was in the right place at the right time to help. I am grateful that you gave me a chance, that you let me into your life and your heart." "I did not give you a chance," Amelia said with a smile. "You fought your way in with your stubborn determination to make things right. You did not give me any choice but to fall in love with you. Well, I have always been persistent when something matters, and I have always been yours." They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. The farm they had saved together continued to thrive under Daniel's care. The wheat fields, a testament to what could be built when people face consequences and work to make things right. The silver locket Dalton had given Amelia all those years ago still hung around her neck, though it now contained different photographs. Their wedding day, their children as babies, their grandchildren. But sometimes she would open it and remember the original photos, her parents and the young Dalton and Timothy standing in the wheat field, and she would marvel at the beautiful life that had grown from such devastating beginnings. When Dalton finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Amelia holding his hand, the whole town mourned the loss of a man who had embodied integrity and justice. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, including the now middle-aged men who had once trampled a wheat field and learned the most important lesson of their lives. Amelia lived another 5 years after Dalton's death, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. She spent those years telling stories about the cowboy who had ridden into her life and changed everything, making sure the next generation understood that one person standing up for what was right could make all the difference in the world. On her final day, weak but content in the bed she had shared with Dalton for so many years, she gathered her children around her and told them one last time about the morning the wheat was trampled and the mysterious stranger who had promised to make it right. "He saved more than my farm," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He saved my life, my future, everything that mattered. And then he loved me with a devotion that never wavered for 53 years. I have been blessed beyond measure, and it all started with a cowboy who cared enough to stop and help a stranger in need." Daniel held one hand, and Anna held the other, while David stood at the foot of the bed with tears streaming down his face. We know, Mama. We have always known how much you loved each other. Love him still, Amelia whispered. And I will love him forever, wherever I am going. She closed her eyes then and slipped away peacefully, a smile on her weathered face. Her children buried her next to Dalton in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the wheat fields, and on her headstone they carved the words she had requested. Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She was loved by a cowboy who made things right. The farm continued through the generations, passed from Daniel to his children, and eventually to his grandchildren. The story of the trampled wheat and the justice that followed was told and retold, becoming part of the family history that each new generation learned. The wheat fields continued to produce golden harvests year after year, the soil enriched by the love and labor of all who had tended it. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the mist rose from the earth and the world felt suspended between night and day, people swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the wheat rows, one tall and broad-shouldered in a weather-beaten hat, the other smaller and graceful in a calico dress. They would appear for just a moment in the golden light, then fade away like a dream, leaving only the whisper of wheat stalks swaying in the breeze. The legacy of Amelia and Dalton lived on, not just in their descendants, but in the values they had embodied. Timothy's children and grandchildren ran their horse ranch with integrity, treating every customer fairly and standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. The children of Charlie Winters, James Porter, Marcus Sloan, and Pete Daniels all grew up hearing the story of their father's mistakes and the lesson they learned, and they raised their own children to understand that privilege was a responsibility, not a license for carelessness. The small farm that had nearly been lost to trampled wheat became one of the most productive in the Walla Walla Valley, proof that good things could grow from disaster when people were willing to face consequences and work to make amends. The wheat that grew there was said to be particularly golden, particularly sweet, as if the land itself remembered the love that had been planted along with the seeds all those years ago. Decades after Amelia and Dalton had both passed, their great-great-grandchildren still worked the land, still told the story of how it all began. They showed visitors the wheat fields where the trampling had happened, now legendary ground where justice had prevailed against all odds. They spoke with pride about their ancestors who had built something lasting from nothing but determination and love. And on the mantle in the farmhouse that had been expanded and renovated but never abandoned, there sat that silver locket Dalton had given Amelia, now a family treasure passed down through generations. Inside were faded photographs that had been carefully preserved, showing a handsome cowboy with intense blue eyes and a beautiful woman with a smile that could light up the world. Beneath the locket was a small brass plaque that told the whole story in just a few words. He trampled nothing, but came to right a wrong. She gave him love and a place to belong. Together they built a legacy that will never fade. The wheat still grew golden in the Walla Walla sun, generation after generation, sustained by the rich soil and the memory of a love that had started with a promise to make things right. And though Amelia and Dalton had long since passed from this world, their love story lived on, told in whispers and shouts, in family gatherings and community celebrations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of our greatest blessings. The riders who trampled the wheat had thought they were just having fun, just racing through the countryside without a care. They had no idea that their careless cruelty would set in motion events that would change lives, teach lessons, and create a love story that would be remembered for generations. They had no idea that being forced to replant every single seed would transform them from thoughtless boys into responsible men who would carry the weight of that lesson for the rest of their lives. And Dalton Xavier, the drifting cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger, never imagined that his commitment to justice would lead him to the love of his life, to a home and family that would give meaning to all his wandering years. He had thought he was just tracking down some riders and making them face consequences. He had no idea he was riding toward his destiny. As for Amelia, she had knelt in the dirt that terrible morning, thinking her life was over, thinking there was no hope left for her or her farm or her future. She could never have imagined that the destruction of her wheat field was actually the beginning of everything she had ever wanted, the moment when her real life would finally begin. Their story became more than just a tale about trampled wheat and replanted seeds. It became a story about justice and consequences, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about the transformative power of love. It became a story about how the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, about how strangers can become family, about how one person's courage can change everything. And so the wheat continued to grow, year after year, generation after generation, fed by the rich soil and the memory of a love that had conquered every obstacle. The fields that had once been trampled were now abundant. The land that had nearly been lost was now thriving, and the legacy of Amelia and Dalton Xavier lived on in every golden stalk that swayed in the Washington breeze. Their love story was complete, beginning with destruction and ending with a legacy that would last forever. From the moment Dalton rode up to that trampled wheat field until the day their great great grandchildren worked the same land, telling the same story to their own children, it was a tale of love triumphant, justice served, and a cowboy who made things right.